Not a conventional soldier. From SAS, Rogue Heroes, the Authorised Wartime History, by Ben MacIntyre. 5 months before Operation Squatter, a tall, thin soldier lay grumpy and immobile in a Cairo hospital bed. The 25-year-old officer had been brought into the Scottish military hospital on 15 June 1941, paralysed from the waist down. A letter to his mother from the War Office stated that he had suffered a contusion of the back as a result of enemy action. This was not, strictly speaking, true. The injured soldier had not set eyes on the enemy. He had jumped out of a plane without a helmet or proper training, ripped his parachute on the tail fin, and plummeted to earth at roughly twice the recommended speed. The impact had knocked him out and badly injured his spine, leaving him temporarily blinded and without feeling in his legs. The doctors feared he would never walk again. Even before his parachuting accident, the officer's contribution to the war effort had been minimal. He lacked the most basic military discipline, could not march straight, and was so lazy his comrades had nicknamed him the Giant Sloth. Since being posted to Egypt with the British Commando Force, he had spent much of his time in Cairo's bars and clubs or gambling at the racecourse. The nurses at the hospital knew him well, for he frequently popped in during the morning, wave-faced and liverish, to request a blast from the oxygen bottle to cure his hangover. Before his parachute jump landed him in hospital, he had been under investigation to establish whether he was malingering and ought to be court-martialed. His fellow officers found him charming and entertaining. His senior commanders, for the most part, regarded him as impertinent, incompetent, and profoundly irritating. On completing officer training, he had received a blunt appraisal: irresponsible and unremarkable. Lieutenant David Stirling of the Scots Guards was not a conventional soldier. The writer Evelyn Waugh, a fellow officer in the Commando Force, came to visit Stirling about 3 weeks after his admission to hospital. Waugh had been misinformed by the matron that one of Stirling's legs had already been amputated, and he would likely lose the other. "I can't feel a thing," Stirling told his friend. Embarrassed as Englishmen tend to be when faced with disability, Waugh kept up a steady stream of meaningless small talk, perched on the edge of the bed, and studiously avoided the subject of his friend's paralysis. Every so often, however, he would sneak a surreptitious glance to where Stirling's remaining leg ought to be, and whenever he did so, Stirling, with extreme effort, would wiggle the big toe of his right foot. Finally, Waugh realized he was being teased and hit Stirling with a pillow. "You bastard, Stirling! When did it happen?" "Minutes before you came. It takes a bit of effort, but it's a start." Stirling was regaining the use of his legs. Others might have cried for joy. For Stirling, however, the first sign of his recovery was an excellent opportunity to play a practical joke on one of Britain's greatest novelists. It would take 2 more weeks before Stirling could stand upright, and several more before he was able to hobble about. But during those 2 months of enforced inaction, he did a great deal of thinking, something which, in spite of his reputation as a feckless gadabout, he was rather good at. The commandos were intended to be Britain's storm troops, volunteers selected and trained to carry out destructive raids against Axis targets. Prime Minister Winston Churchill had decided that the ideal theatre in which to deploy the commandos would be North Africa, where they could conduct seaborne raids against the enemy bases along the Mediterranean coast. In Stirling's unsolicited opinion, the concept was not working. Most of the time, the commandos were inactive, awaiting the order for a great assault that never came. On the rare occasions they were deployed, the results had been disappointing. The German and Italian troops fully expected to be attacked from the sea and were primed and waiting. The commando forces were simply too large and cumbersome to launch an assault without being spotted. The element of surprise was immediately lost. But what, wondered Stirling, if the combat troops attacked from the opposite direction? To the south, stretching between Egypt and Libya, lay the great sand sea, a vast waterless expanse of unbroken dunes covering 45,000 square miles. One of the most inhospitable environments on earth, the desert was considered by the Germans to be virtually impassable, a natural barrier, and they therefore left it largely unprotected and entirely unpatrolled. This was one sea the Hun was not watching, Stirling reflected. If mobile teams of highly trained men under cover of darkness could be infiltrated onto the enemy's desert flank, they might be able to sabotage airfields, supply depots, communications links, railways and roads, and then slip back into the embracing emptiness of the sand sea. A commando force several hundred strong could attack only one target at a time, but a number of smaller units moving quickly, raiding suddenly, and then retreating swiftly could destroy multiple targets simultaneously. The opportunity to attack the enemy in the rear when he least expects it is the pipe dream of every general. The peculiar geography of North Africa offered just such a possibility, reflected Stirling, as he lay half paralyzed in his hospital bed, trying to wiggle his toes. Stirling's idea was the result of wishful thinking more than expertise. It had emerged not from long hours of reflection and study, but from the acute boredom of convalescence. It was based on intuition, imagination, and self-confidence, of which Stirling had plenty, rather than experience of desert warfare, of which he had none. But it was an inspired idea, the sort of idea that could only have occurred to someone as strange and remarkable as Archibald David Stirling.